Hello, my friends, and welcome. I'm your host, Lydia, and this is Whispers and Warnings, a podcast where true crime, the paranormal, and magic all come together. Here, we don't do deep dives. I'm not going to be bringing you any new or groundbreaking information. But if you're not someone who, like me, is knee-deep in the world of true crime, or if you just don't have an hour plus to devote to an episode, I'm here to bring you an interesting story in a slightly more digestible amount of time. So light a candle, take a peek over your shoulder, and let's jump in. Imagine a little old woman with a frail frame, floral dress, and a poof of white hair atop her head. Large horn-rimmed glasses resting on her aged face. She loves to cook and even has a published book of recipes. Only this woman isn't your grandmother. She's Dorothea Puente, a convicted serial killer. Dorothea Helen Gray was born on January 9, 1929 in Redlands, California. Her parents, Trudy May and Jesse James Gray, were both alcoholics. Reports of her family show her from having anywhere between 6 and 17 siblings, but either way, her father was a real piece of work. He would often make threats to kill himself in front of the kids and hold a gun to his head in front of them. But he died of tuberculosis in 1937, and sadly, life did not get better for Dorothea or her siblings. Their mother worked as a sex worker and lost custody of the kids in 1938, and then died in a motorcycle accident later that same year. The kids went to live in an orphanage where they were sadly sexually abused. Dorothea married her first husband young, at age 16, in 1945. Her husband was a soldier named Fred McFowle, who had just returned from fighting in World War II. The pair had 2 daughters between 1946 and 1948, but sent one child to live with relatives in Sacramento and placed the other up for adoption. It's unclear why the couple chose to give up the children. I mean, they were young, but having children young was common at that time, especially after returning from war. In the spring of 1948, Dorothea was arrested for using forged checks to pay for some accessories. She pled guilty to the forgery and spent 4 months in jail, followed by 3 years on probation. All of these antics were apparently too much for Fred, and he left her 6 months after her release. 4 years later, in 1952, she allegedly married a merchant seaman named Axel Bren Johansson in San Francisco using a fake persona. She called herself Tia Sengola Nayarda, a Muslim woman of Egyptian and Israeli descent. And now listen, I'm not trying to victim blame Axel here, but looking at pictures of Dorothea, it was extremely clear that she was a white woman. I guess this was 1952, before the days of the internet. Maybe Axel hadn't seen a whole lot of diversity in his day, but this should have been a red flag from his new spouse. Now, if Dorothea wasn't a murderer, I would have described her as a real hot ticket, a real ham, because in 1960, she was arrested for owning and operating a bookkeeping business that was a front for a brothel. This ordeal got her a 90-day sentence in the Sacramento County Jail. Following her release, Dorothea was briefly committed to DeWitt State Hospital after a run of binging, criminal behavior, and attempts at her own life. The doctors there diagnosed her as a pathological liar with an unstable personality. It was following this that Axel had had enough and the couple divorced in 1966. She continued to use her surname, Johansson, though, and took on the alias Sharon Johansson. Sharon was a devout Christian who established her reputation as a caregiver while providing young women who were victims of abuse with room and board. 2 years later, in 1968, Dorothea married a man named Roberto Jose Puente and became Dorothea Puente, as millions would come to know her. The couple separated after only 16 months together. Dorothea cited domestic abuse, and when she went to serve him with the divorce petition, he fled to Mexico. The divorce was delayed and wasn't finalized until 1973. The two continued to have a turbulent relationship following the divorce, where Dorothea finally filed a restraining order in 1975. Following all of the drama with the divorce, she decided to really throw herself into focusing on running a boarding house in Sacramento. Dorothea would take in and aid alcoholics, unhoused people, and the mentally ill. She would hold Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and assist individuals with signing up to receive their Social Security benefits. That's going to be a key here. To really drive the nail home, she let her hair grow out gray without dyeing it, wore large glasses, and vintage clothes, really taking on a matronly look. She had also become a respected member of the local Hispanic community by funding charities, scholarships, and radio programs. She wasn't done with love, though, and met and married Pedro Angel Montalvo, who left abruptly after only a week of marriage. Then in December 1978, Dorothea was arrested for illegally cashing 34 state and federal checks that actually belonged to her tenants. Let's not forget, Dorothea was a hardened jailbird by this time, but for this crime, she was only given 3 years probation and ordered to pay $4,000 in restitution. And this is where we sadly come to a long line of victims. It seems like while a criminal, Dorothea had managed to avoid much scrutiny from the law in between her crimes. Maybe her crimes to this point had been considered petty, or maybe her age and appearance aided in her going undetected. Dorothea began a pattern of targeting people who were living on the fringes of society, those she suspected would not be missed if they went missing. In January 1982, she met Malcolm McKenzie. He was a 74-year-old at the time and later reported that Dorothea must have slipped something into his drink after he woke up, having been robbed of his collection of coins and jewelry, some of which was literally on his incapacitated body. In April of that same year, Ruth Monroe, age 61, passed away due to respiratory depression caused by an overdose of codeine. Ruth had visited Dorothea's home 2 weeks prior, and while the death was originally ruled as an overdose, it was later classified as homicide. In May of 1982, Dorothy Osborne, age 49, was also drugged and robbed by Dorothea. This time, she was caught and convicted of 3 grand theft charges. This gave her a 5-year prison sentence, state parole until 1986, and added another 2 years onto her already existing federal parole sentence, now ending in 1990. It really seems like Dorothea was escalating during this time and her criminal activity was becoming more rapid, but these are just the reported crimes or crimes that she was later convicted of. Who knows how many until this point had actually gone undetected. And also keep in mind at this point, Dorothea is 53 years old. Her activity and desires further escalated while she was in prison. During her incarceration, she started corresponding with a 77-year-old retiree from Oregon named Everson Theodore Gilmuth. After serving only one half of her prison sentence, Dorothea was released in September 1985, and Gilmuth quickly arrived at her boarding house with his truck and trailer. Dorothea was apparently so smitten that she wrote a letter to Gilmuth's sister stating that the two were soon to be married. Or was she? At that same time, she hired a handyman to build a 6-foot by 30-inch by 30-inch storage box. Guys. And promised him Gilmuth's truck and $800 as payment. But don't worry, because Gilmuth wasn't going to be there to miss his truck. Shortly after completing the storage box, the handyman noticed that it was nailed shut. Dorothea then asked him to help her move the box to storage, and it now weighed almost 300 pounds. The storage location was next to a river about an hour's drive away. It's unclear how Dorothea convinced this handyman to just leave the box there. I would assume he likely had his suspicions and just wanted to get away from the situation with his life. But a fisherman discovered the box and called the authorities to report it. Unsurprisingly, a badly decomposed body was found inside. The body had been wrapped in several plastic bags, covered with a bedsheet, and secured with electrical tape surrounded by mothballs and toilet deodorizer. It took 2 years for them to identify the body of Everson Theodore Gilmuth in 1988. During that time, Dorothea continued to write letters to his sister to make her believe he was still alive. She forged the signature on the title of his truck to hand it over as payment and continued cashing Gilmuth's benefits checks until July of the following year. Also in 1986, Dorothea called a notary to come to the hospital room of a 78-year-old woman named Leona Carpenter, who had suffered a flurazepam overdose. And in case you're wondering what that is, like I was, it's a benzo used for short-term treatment of insomnia, so a very strong sleeping pill, basically. Dorothea was given power of attorney over Carpenter and began cashing her Social Security checks just 10 days later. Now, let me just say, having been a notary, this is totally unethical. Maybe the documents were different in 1988, but when I was a notary, probably 15 years ago, you couldn't, or I should say you shouldn't, notarize any document for anyone that wasn't of sound mind. I would imagine that not only was this woman 78 years old, but she had also just experienced an overdose, and it would be really hard to make the determination if she was of sound mind or not. And it literally says on some of the legal documents, and I specifically believe in the power of attorney, it says that in order for the person to attest to signing over the power of attorney, they have to be of sound mind. And the notary is not only notarizing the document, but they're notarizing that this person is of sound mind. So this is A, why that notary shouldn't have done that, and B, why you should establish these things before an emergency happens just to be prepared. Anyway, when Carpenter was discharged a few weeks later, guess where she went back to live? The boarding house. And once again, she returned to the hospital, and once again, she was discharged. Then in February of 1987, she disappeared. Following the disappearance of Carpenter, James Gallup, age 62, moved into the home. He was suffering from some health complications, and doctors had found a potentially malignant tumor on his colon. He had agreed to more testing, but Dorothea called the doctor's office and told them that he had skipped town and gone down to LA indefinitely. Later in the year in 1987, Vera Faye Martin, age 61, went to live in the boarding house. Dorothea began forging a number of Social Security checks in her name, totaling a loss of $7,000. A few weeks after moving in, Martin failed to contact her daughter on her birthday, which she always did every year, so this was very unlike her, but she was nowhere to be found. Dorothea was now turning clients very quickly. Following the disappearance of Martin, Dorothy Miller, age 65, moved in on October 21st, 1987. Dorothea introduced her to Ricardo Ordica, who was the owner of the property that she had rented the boarding house from, and he became the representative payee for Miller's checks. Just weeks after Miller arrived, a carpet cleaner was hired by Dorothea to remove a large pile of foul-smelling slime from Miller's room. Dorothea continued to cash her checks, totaling over $11,000. In late November, Brenda Trujillo, a former cellmate of Dorothea's, was now living in the boarding house. She sent a letter to the Social Security office in Sacramento accusing Dorothea of stealing her Social Security checks. Trujillo claimed that Dorothea had drugged her and called her parole officer, which resulted in her parole being revoked and stopping the checks. I'm presuming that's because she was sent back to jail, but that part of the story wasn't super clear. In February of 1988, Alvaro Bert Gonzalez Montoya, age 51, arrived at the Puente boarding house. Dorothea was designated as the payee of Montoya's benefit checks shortly after. At the end of August, a roommate noticed that a man was removing Montoya's clothing from the closet. He had last been seen on August 24th and missed a scheduled appointment on August 29th. Dorothea was telling people that Montoya had simply gone down to Mexico to visit his relatives. Social workers attempted to contact him for the next couple of months without any luck. In November, Dorothea asked a man named Donald Anthony, a former convict who had been working in her yard, to contact Montoya's social worker and pretend to be his brother-in-law. Donald agreed and called the social worker, but his story didn't quite line up with Dorothea's. He stated that he had personally transported Montoya from the boarding house in Sacramento to Utah. The social worker was immediately suspicious and told Dorothea that she would be calling the police. The pair tried to cover their tracks, and on November 10th, the social worker received a letter allegedly from Montoya's brother-in-law wrapped in a paper towel to avoid fingerprints, very casually. In March of 1988, just after Montoya had moved in, Benjamin Fink, age 55, came to reside at the boarding house. Fink's brother came to visit him on a weekly basis for the first 6 weeks, but by the end of April, Fink was gone. Another tenant complained of a foul odor coming from Fink's room, but was told that the plumbing had backed up. But on April 29th, a casual 12 bags of cement were delivered to the house. A large hole had been dug near the garden shed that was later filled with concrete. The jig was up at the end of 1988. On November 7th, shortly after Montoya had gone missing and suspicions had been raised, police spoke to John Sharp, a former resident of the boarding house, about the disappearance of Montoya. He initially lied and said that he had seen Montoya just 2 days earlier, but slipped a note to the officers saying, "She wants me to lie to you." He was able to meet up with them outside of the home and tell his story. On November 11th, a detective returned to the residence and began digging on the property with Dorothea's permission. Focusing on areas that seemed to have been recently disturbed, the detective discovered the first body within 30 minutes. While they were busy digging up the bodies in her yard, Dorothea slipped away from the police. And I have to believe that her grandmotherly appearance was partially to blame for this oversight by the police. But anyway, an all points bulletin was issued for her. Using the alias Donna Johansson, Dorothea was checked into a motel in Los Angeles. A man named Charles Wilgus contacted Jean Silver of CBS after seeing Dorothea on the CBS morning newscast. The two had met the day prior at a bar nearby the motel. On November 16th, 1988, the two men contacted the police, and Dorothea was arrested the same day and formally charged with the murder of Montoya. And remember the handyman who helped her build the storage box? His name was Ishmael Flores, and he faced charges for his assistance with moving the body in Gilmuth's murder. However, the statute of limitations had already expired, so he was granted immunity for his testimony against Dorothea. In March of 1989, an amended complaint was filed that charged Dorothea with 9 counts of murder with special circumstance, qualifying it as a death penalty case. Investigators showed that most of her victims had been drugged to the point of overdose, wrapped in bed sheets and plastic, and dragged into open pits in the backyard for burial. In May of 1990, the prosecutor rested his case for the preliminary hearing to determine if the case could proceed to trial. 71 witnesses were called and 108 exhibits were submitted. In June of 1990, a judge ruled that there was more than enough evidence to send the case to trial, and Dorothea pled not guilty. Surprisingly, the jury was deadlocked on several of the cases. They easily determined that she was guilty of the murders of Benjamin Fink, Leona Carpenter, and Dorothy Miller, but were in and out of deadlock on Ruth Monroe, Everson Theodore Gilmuth, Betty Mae Palmer, James Gallup, Vera Faye Martin, and Alvaro Gonzalez Montoya. This was enough to spare her the death penalty, and she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in 1993 and incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. In 1997, an appellate court in San Jose affirmed the standing murder convictions but ordered an examination of alleged juror misconduct. Following a hearing, the judge rejected each allegation of jury misconduct in the trial. And I have to say, allegedly, in my opinion, some of the jury must have felt sympathy for Dorothea based on her age and appearance. There's no other explanation on how they could see such an, again, in my opinion, obvious murder case where the body was found in the person's backyard and say that they for sure murdered one person but not the other. Even though they were all killed in the same way and she was stealing money from all of their benefits, allegedly in my opinion. Dorothea died in prison on March 27, 2011 from natural causes at age 82. 2 things of note. Dorothea started corresponding with Shane Bugbee in 1998. A book titled Cooking with a Serial Killer was published in 2004 that includes a lengthy interview, almost 50 recipes, and various pieces of art sent to Bugbee by Dorothea. And finally, I want to end on one more suspected victim of Dorothea's, a 58-year-old man named Eugene Gamel. Dorothea had been his landlady, and his death was ultimately ruled a suicide by overdose, so she was never charged. But that could have been a potential victim of her in her early days. I always feel that it's important to name all of the victims in cases like this. Everyone always remembers the killers themselves, but it's the victims that are more worth remembering. Now that is all I have for you today. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing or leaving a comment or sending me a message on Instagram. I have an Instagram for the podcast now. It's under Whispers and Warnings Pod. And please come back for another episode next week. As always, drink your water, take your meds if you need them, and stay spooky.